Hello, literary themes and poetry students. Welcome once again to our lecture module. Today we're going to be looking at two poems by the great Irish modernist poet William Butler Yeats. The first one is entitled The Second Coming, and the second one is entitled Sailing to Byzantium. Perhaps before I start talking about Yeats, I might want to situate him along with a number of other important early 20th century poets within the literary movement known as Modernism. Modernism, was a series of artistic, philosophical movements at the beginning of the 20th century that were a reaction to some of the problems that had happened in the recent past, most notably World War I from 1914 to 1918, and ironically enough, the Spanish influenza pandemic in 1918, paralleling something that we're living through right now with the COVID-19 crisis. And these two episodes, along with other ones, the Russian Revolution, in Yeats's case also, there was a failed attempt at rebellion in Ireland, his native Ireland, in 1916. So in a short period of years, there was a whole bunch of political upheaval. And what happened is that all of this upheaval led to a serious distrust in the way that the world was organized and the way that people understood the world. This has been coming for quite a while. In the latter parts of the 19th century, things like Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and the elaboration of the theory of natural selection, which undermines a long-found belief in creationism and replaces it with the idea of evolution, that humans have evolved from the higher primates. Similarly, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity and special theory of relativity in the beginning of the 20th century kind of destabilized our understanding of the physical world. So Newtonian mechanics, which had been, the dominant way of seeing the construction of the physical universe for hundreds of years, was now replaced by this kind of complex idea of the space-time continuum and E equals mc squared and etc. That made it hard for us to sort of see our place in the world. And similarly, Sigmund Freud's theories of psychological theories, his interpretation of dreams and his theory of the id, the ego, and the superego that kind of addressed the psychology of the human mind and sort of brought to the forefront all sorts of unconscious and subconscious motivations that humans have. So all these things were just sort of a sea change in the way that humans understood the world that they inhabited and understood what was going on around them. And so modernism became a reaction, as I said, in the aftermath of these traumatic incidents, that modernism became an artistic reaction whereby the feeling was that the nation state and the church, those two pillars of sort of organized society, had pretty much failed miserably in their ability to predict the way things would go and also to sort of control the unrolling. And so the war and the pandemic killed millions and millions of people, and there was a real sense of dejection and a sense among particularly many artists that perhaps art could be a way forward and a way to show us, to rethink the world we live in. And so modernism is a movement. We see it in the visual arts through things like Cubism, Picasso and Georges Braque in France in the early, the first years of the 20th century began this movement, and it gathered force in the coming years, sort of a non-representational, non-purely representational, something that tries to mimic three-dimensional space. So perception and the way that we interact with art and the way we perceive art became an important part of that. In music, you have these kind of discordant classical musicians like Igor Stravinsky, the Sacré du Printemps, the Rite of Spring, and you have Bela Bartok and a whole slew of other composers who create a music that is less melodious and much more discordant, getting at something a little more, a level of intensity that perhaps didn't exist previous to that. And similarly in literature, you have a series of important writers, William Faulkner, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, in the realm of narrative fiction, where we break with the conventions of the realist novel and we move towards something much more multiform. Stream of consciousness and inner awareness and things like that become much more prioritized. We have a polyphonic narrative form rather than having a godlike disembodied narrator, which was typically the realist novelists' go-to form. We start having multiple narrations, as I said, stream of consciousness narration, where we're inside the head of a character, achronological forms as well, rather than a linear, straightforward narrative. So all these things are very, very disruptive with respect to the arts. And in poetry, we see it as well. The modernist poets tend to be very complex. T.S. Eliot, actually probably the most famous modernist poet, wrote The Wasteland, which is kind of a retelling of the myths of related to King Arthur and the Fisher King and all these tales, and it's kind of this feeling of desolation and sterility in the modern world. And certainly William Butler Yeats' The Second Coming has some kind of ominous foreboding to it as well. As I said, Yeats is an Irish playwright. He's very well loved in his native Ireland. He wrote a poem about, a famous poem about the uprising in 1916 entitled Easter 1916. And the poem we're going to look at right now, The Second Coming, is a curious poem. It's written a few years later. I believe it was published in 1920. And it takes its title from an allusion to the Bible and the second coming of Christ. Christianity is basically a fulfilled Jewish sect. Christ was a Jew, and he came and presumably lived on this earth, and then he was crucified. And according to the Christians, he was crucified, died, and was buried. On the third day, he rose again in fulfillment of the scriptures, and he ascended into heaven. And then at the end of time, at the apocalypse, something that we've seen alluded to numerous times in the semester, most notably Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, talking to his lady and telling her that she could refuse his advances until the conversion of the Jews. Conversion of the Jews is an allusion to the end of time when Christ will return. And typically Jewish scripture is waiting for a Messiah. The Messiah is someone who's going to come at the end of time and confront humanity. Christian ideology suggests that Jesus was the Messiah, and the second coming, when he returns again, will be a very profound comment on modern humanity. So we have a pointedly Christian context for the poem. However, the poem seems to be, I don't want to say anti-Christian, but it seems to be somewhat ominous. Now, of course, in Christian ideology, the second coming is the apocalypse. It's the end of time. So, in a sense, maybe it's right that the poem should have an apocalyptic tone. And of course, it might be a curious poem for us to read at this particular moment, because we are living something very, unprecedented, and each day brings us these new bizarre experiences. I don't know if you followed the news, but in the past days, the price of oil has become negative. So you can, if you want to sell somebody a barrel of oil, you have to pay them On Monday, it was $37. It's fluctuating rather wildly each day. But that's never happened in my lifetime, that the price of oil is negative. Oil has typically had a very high intrinsic value. And so people on the economic level, and obviously with the pandemic fear that is enveloping our society right now, there's a sense of that the apocalyptic aura is in the air. So we're approximately 100 years away from when this poem was composed, and yet it seems perhaps possibly timely. And so we have a couple of very strong images in the poem. There's an image of a gyre that's a very prominent symbol in Yeats's poetic lexicon. The gyre is something that spins. It's a spinning form, and it's kind of like a spiral. And we'll talk a little bit about how Yeats sees the gyre, because he sees it as a kind of a measure of human history. And we imagine that there are these 2,000-year cycles, and that humanity goes through these 2,000-year cycles. Now, of course, when we talk about millennials, people who were born near the time of the year 2000, we're talking about the end of one of those cycles, ironically. Christ lived approximately 2,000 years ago. And so these cycles that Yeats is alluding to in the poem are these gyres of 2,000 years. And so we had the ancient Egyptians were approximately 2,000 years before the Common Era. And then we had the coming of Jesus Christ, and supposedly this initiated a new cycle of 2,000 years. And presumably at the time that the poem is written, we are at the end of one cycle and at the beginning of another cycle. And so this is part of Yeats's idea within the poem. And so if you don't understand that, he wrote a book called A Vision that has a very, very elaborate elucidation of what he believed with regards to these ideas of the gyre. It's kind of sort of theosophical and somewhat complex, but that's not that important for our purposes, his ideas about the gyre. What's important for us is the poem. And so it begins, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. The falcon is a royal hunting bird. Typically during the medieval period, you had a falcon, and the falconer controlled the falcon, and it was a bird of regal bearing, a bird of prey. So it would go and hunt. And this idea of the turning gyre, the falcon is getting further and further away from the falconer. So there's this almost this centripetal force. It's like when you spin around and you hold something, a weight, as it goes further and further away, it gains more and more force. And so the falcon is getting further and further from the falconer, and he cannot hear him. The voice of the falconer does not carry that far. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Once again, that idea of centripetal force, where you have this spinning going further and further away. Things Fall Apart is the title that the great African writer Chinua Achebe wrote his novel, I believe in 1962 or thereabouts, a novel about rural Nigeria. And it was about these kind of traditional way of life that was being replaced by modern life. And so this tribal culture that had existed for centuries was suddenly being replaced by a kind of a generic, more modern culture. So it's a little bit disparaging. There are actually a number of famous books and other works that take their titles from this poem. It's a very famous poem, probably Yeats's greatest poem. So turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. That first stanza has a whole bunch of rather apocalyptic and distressing images. So we've seen the falcon getting further away from the falconer to the point where the things, the structures of society perhaps, are beginning to break down. As I mentioned, this is right in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, the Spanish influenza pandemic, World War I, a horrific, long, and very, very brutal war. You had also, as I said, the rebellion in Yeats's Ireland. And so we have this image of violence, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Okay, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The blood-dimmed tide implies that the tide, the flow of the waves coming in and out, is tinted with blood, right? The color of it has changed. There's so many dead people, so much blood, that the water in the ocean has become red. It's a very strong image from Shakespeare's Macbeth when after he has killed King Duncan, he makes mention of the fact of turning the seas. The blood on his hands will turn the seas incarnadine. In other words, it'll turn them red forever. He'll never be able to wash it off. So here we have the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Ceremony of innocence is a curious image because it could allude, if we think of the rites, Christian rites, in the context of this Christian poem, the ceremony of innocence could easily allude to the ceremony of baptism. Baptism is what welcomes a person into the family of the Catholic Church. It's a holy rite that is typically reserved for newborns, and one of the key things with the rite of baptism is that if a baby dies before they're baptized, it's considered by Catholics to be a terrible, terrible thing because they haven't been welcomed into the community of the church, and they will not go to heaven. They will stay in limbo. So there's kind of that's a curious ideological idea. But anyways, you have the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So the baby, the ceremony of baptism, the priest takes the baby and dunks his head into the water. And here you have the image of the baby being held under the water and drowned. Everything is very, very violent, very vivid, and very distressing. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So in other words, the good people are kind of reserved. They're sitting back. They're not sure whether or not they should act. But the bad people are very active, proactive, and so the best lack all conviction. They don't want to do anything. They're not convinced that they should do anything. They're hesitant, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So you have a world that's dominated by evil, basically, and violence. Now, of course, looking back on something where, Spanish influenza killed approximately 20 million people. World War I, another 10 million people. So in the past 5 years, at the time that this poem was written, 30 million people died. That's in a world where there were a whole lot less people than there are today. So this is frankly cataclysmic. And you could imagine that people might feel that there was some apocalyptic sense somewhere. And of course, the second stanza reiterates that fear or that possible awareness. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Okay. Again, Revelation is one of those books of the Bible where at the end, Christ will return and he will come back and he will judge. It's often referred to as the last judgment. And the sense in with Christian dogma is that when Christ comes back, everyone will be sort of divided up, and you will be separated into the groups of the good people, the people who followed the teachings properly, and they will go to heaven, and all the other people, the people who did not follow the teachings properly, the people who were not Christian or Catholic or whatever the context that's being judged, will all go to hell. And so you have this sense of the revelation. The revelation is kind of the revelation of Christ's divinity at the end. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. So the statement is reiterated. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming with an exclamation point in the middle of a line. Okay, the second coming of the second coming. So it's restated, and it's suggested with almost a sense of awe, and then a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi, the spirit of the world, troubles my sight. And so the speaker fixes on this sense here that something of monumental import is about to happen, right? Surely, surely, the second coming, the second coming. That repetition and that reiteration kind of reinforces the belief and the sense of the importance here of what's happening. So suddenly the speaker is kind of overwhelmed by this image, right? Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. It is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. The rest of that second stanza once again continues with the tone of the first stanza, this sense of violence and situation out of human control, right? We saw that with the turning and the turning of the gyre, the widening gyre, and now we have this creature coming to life, and the creature again fits in with the iconography of Yeats's ideas from a vision of the gyres. And so the vision that troubles his sight is in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. Okay, talking about the Sphinx. The Sphinx, the great Sphinx in Giza, near the pyramids in Egypt, is this giant statue, very famous statue, with the body of a lion and the head of a man. Interestingly, during the 1800s, when Turkey was, the Ottoman Turks were controlled Egypt, they used the Great Sphinx as a practice target for artillery shells. And so the Sphinx that you see now has been kind of shot up and not quite in the state that it once was. So this giant image of this Sphinx, which is, as we said, is this part man, part beast, is associated with the culture of ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt was obviously a great, you had many, many dynasties during the Egyptian time, Tutankhamun and all these other ones, all these amazing artistic creations and these architectural creations. Obviously the pyramids are still something that perplex humanity, again, 4,000 or more years after they were created. And so Yeats has this symbol of the Egyptian era as kind of something present in the poem. And so what we see is these periods of time that I mentioned when talking about his theory of the universe, that there would be 2,000-year period, there would be an ascendancy, and this spiral would kind of go down and down and down and down. And then at the end, a new spiral would start, and it would be wide, and it would also go up and up and up, gradually getting tighter. And so we have these periods that he's associating with 2,000 years. And of course, he has the Egyptians ending at the time of Christ, where presumably Christ and Christianity take over from the worldview of the Egyptians. And then from the year 0, let's say, that's how we date our calendar, to now, to close to 2000, although Yeats was writing in the 1920s, but he's assuming that we're getting close to the end of that cycle, that the Christian era has been going on, and suddenly we're at the end of it. And as I said, all of these terrible things that had happened in the recent past, the war, the pandemic kind of diminished people's faith. And it was what I was saying is one of the tenets of modernism. Modernism suggests that these institutions have not held up very well. They have not done the jobs that they needed to do, and that perhaps the place of art comes in to take over or to do something useful that these structures, these social structures, have not been able to do. And so we have here what looks like the beginning of the end, almost, of the Christian era, where this creature is coming to life. And of course, there are a number of references here that suggest that, right? So we have this giant Sphinx rumbling to life, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, pitiless, lacking pity, blank, not expressing any emotion, is moving its slow thighs. It's just this lumbering giant creature. It's a statue coming to life almost. While all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. Okay, the birds are all flying around in circles, indignant, so they're unhappy. The darkness drops again. Almost has the feeling of that auspicious moment of the solar eclipse, right? A solar eclipse when the sun is blocked by the moon for a period of moments, if you're in totality, in a total solar eclipse, and it becomes night again, which is often is associated with something very, very auspicious. He kind of brings that into the play here because the birds tend to go crazy when that happens, and darkness in the middle of the day comes. By the way, there will be a total solar eclipse that will pass very close to Quebec. Quebec City will not be in the area of totality, but I believe the city of Montreal and even perhaps Sherbrooke will in 2024. I believe April 2024. So might want to get your calendars out and mark it, because if you're around, it's worth seeing. So anyways, this auspicious moment is alluded to here, and then we get a few things that connect us to the idea of the Christian era coming to an end. 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. Here we have 20 centuries, right? 20 centuries is 2,000 years, approximately the time from the birth of Christ. Vexed to nightmare. To be vexed is to be tormented, to be put upon by it. So the stony sleep, this statue that is stone, that has been sleeping, is now coming to life. But it's not a dream, it's a nightmare, right? That sleep, typically when we dream, when we're sleeping, if you have a happy dream is one thing, but an unhappy dream is a nightmare. So vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And the rocking cradle is certainly can bring us back to the image of Jesus. Jesus was a little baby born in the manger to Joseph and Mary. We have this Savior that was a child, an infant, very innocent. And suddenly that era that commenced with his birth and his, the manger and the magi and the all of the, the adoration of the magi and all that that's associated with Jesus as a baby is now coming to its logical end. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Once again, conjuring Jesus in the manger. Bethlehem is where he was born. Joseph and Mary were forced to go to leave, and they were wandering, and they come up in Bethlehem, and they have this child born in a manger outside, not in a real house. And so suddenly the time, again, several associations with the infant Jesus here, the innocence and everything associated with that, are now coming to an end. And we have this juxtaposition between the innocent baby and the rough beast, the statue coming alive with a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, and all of this troubling image. And the last line, of course, the last two lines, and what rough beast, a rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So the rough beast it seems like the image that we have here is closer to, rather than Christ, it almost sounds like the Antichrist, which is something that also has a strong biblical association. So what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem. Slouching, it's not walking upright, it's slouching, kind of a hunched over way of walking. So it slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. It's a question mark. Interestingly, the last line of the poem, slouches towards Bethlehem, was used by the American writer Joan Didion, who wrote a very famous book about San Francisco in the 1960s entitled Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And the book is about some of the things happening in San Francisco. It was the summer of love, and it was peace, love, and hippies, and all these things. But the book was a little bit critical of that, and it saw aspects of that society that were rather distressing. And of course, shortly thereafter, some horrible things happened in California, the Manson murders and all sorts of other things. And so the 60s that started with this idealism and peace and love ended in kind of violence and again, cataclysmic realities. And of course, with Yeats's poem, there's a similar current, because the poem is suggesting that there might be this horrible, violent reality on the horizon. And of course, the poem is written in the beginning of the 1920s. And if you know your history, Adolf Hitler, National Socialism, the Nazi death camps, World War II, and all sorts of really, really horrible things are right around the corner. And a lot of those things started to have their genesis in probably the decade before the war. So starting, around 1930. I mean, the Germans and Hitler, certainly there was a political movement that took a while for it to gain the steam, where they were leading the country and invading Poland and basically laying waste to most of Europe. So, the poem, when we look at it now, from the perspective that it was written and Yeats's attitude about the history that has just lived through and the history that is fast approaching, the poem, seems extremely prescient, seems to be predicting the future almost, in this idea of the Antichrist and certain other realities. So the poem has a special place in the canon for a lot of reasons, but that's one of them. I'd like to move briskly now to another poem by William Butler Yeats entitled Sailing to Byzantium. And Sailing to Byzantium is another one of Yeats's extremely famous poems. This poem has a little bit of a different tone to it, certainly. It's a different type of poem. It's about different things. This is a poem that has the creative power of art as one of its essential elements, and some of the attitudes of society, particularly regarding age. Byzantium is a name for the capital of the Western Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. In around 400 after Christ, the city of Rome, which had been the capital of the Roman Empire, obviously, in the late 400s, was sacked by barbarians from the north, Vandals and Huns. And so they invaded the city, and the capital and the empire moved east. And they moved first to Ravenna on the coast on the eastern coast of Italy, near Venice, and then they kept moving further to what is present-day Istanbul. At the time, they founded it as Constantinople, named after the Emperor Constantine, and it eventually became known as Byzantium in the Middle Ages. And Byzantium was a very famous place, very well known for several of its artistic forms, most notably mosaics, which are pieces of ceramic tile that are used to create an image. And so if you go to some of the churches, the Hagia Sophia, for example, in present-day Istanbul, you see these very spectacular mosaic forms. And also goldsmithing was another art form very well known in Byzantium. And so the poem is a celebration almost of this place, and of Yeats sees it as this kind of getaway, this artistic escape from the society that he lives in. And the society that he lives in, or let's say the society that the speaker is living in and is attempting to get away from, is different. And art is not valued in the same way, and experience and intelligence are not valued in the same way. So if we look at the first stanza, we get the sense of this place, and this place neglects some of the values that the speaker hopes to find somewhere else. This is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. The first line of the poem was taken as a title by Cormac McCarthy for a famous book he wrote, No Country for Old Men. It was made into a movie with Javier Bardem, and pretty well received movie about some drug smuggling gone awry. But the title, addressing Yeats's poem, No Country for Old Men, suggests that there are things there, this idea of the drug smuggling culture, that's not right for an old man. And I believe Tommy Lee Jones plays a sheriff in the movie version that was directed by the Coen brothers, that is sort of, he seems out of his element. That's what the book's about, taking it obviously from the title of the poem, the first line of the poem. So No Country for Old Men suggests that this is a place that does not value age and wisdom. The young are dominant, and the young are presented to us in images of sensuality and physicality. So the idea of everything sort of reproducing springtime of life, and this vitality of spirit that is youth, which is all a wonderful thing, but it's suggesting that the youth are all caught up in the physicality, the physical pleasures of life, and they neglect the other parts of life, and in particular, they neglect the wisdom of the old. So you have this very strong association, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, okay? Images of, as I said, springtime and vitality. Those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl. Whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Here we're talking about physical flesh, right? Begotten, to be conceived, to be born, and to die. It's talking about the cycle of human life. We are born as little babies, we live our lives, eventually we die. And caught in that sensual music, the music of the senses, the dance of life, they neglect monuments of unaging intellect. The second stanza begins, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul-clapped hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. So the speaker in the poem is getting ready to leave this society behind. It's acknowledging the physical, the mortal limits. An old man, an aged man is but a paltry thing, paltry, minimal, just not very much substance. A tattered coat upon a stick, okay? It's this thin, frail, lacking substance because it's vulnerable. An old man is vulnerable. He's physically diminished, and he can die. And the thing that they don't care about here is singing and singing school. Again, allusions to art, We've seen that going back to the pastoral tradition, where the pastoral poems address the shepherds singing their songs, and singing their songs can be an allusion to the poet writing his poems, and it can be just a broader allusion to art in general. And so the younger generations are caught. There's no singing school, but they're studying monuments of its own magnificence. They're too caught up with themselves. They're egotistical. They're self-centered, and they have yet to recognize the values of these other things. And so the speaker, the I, which enters in this stanza, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. And as I said, the holy city of Byzantium is a city, it's now Istanbul, which lies at the interface between Asia and Europe on the Bosphorus. It's now modern-day Turkey, but it was, during the Middle Ages, the seat, the eastern seat of the Roman Empire, up until the 1400s, when the city was overrun and the Ottoman Turks took it over. And so this holy city is very strongly associated with art and artistic power. And so the speaker arrived in Byzantium, is now in this place that's very spiritual, it's almost kind of transcendental. You have the images of song, of gold, and eventually of the idea of the bird again associated with singing. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall. Come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fasten to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the hard artifice of eternity. So once again, we have that idea of mortality, sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal. He's talking about his heart. His heart is sick with desire. It wants things, and it's fastened to a dying animal. This idea of the old man from the previous stanza, this paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. So the old man is this weak, diminished being. But there's something about eternity connected with artifice and art. And so in the early lines of this stanza, we have, O sages, wisdom, wise old men, standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall. Right, again, gold and mosaic are those two art forms traditionally associated with Byzantium. If you look in art history books, you'll see very elaborate goldsmith work, and you'll see fantastic, beautiful mosaic work as well. And so here you have this sense. He introduces also the gyre into this stanza, the holy fire, burn in a gyre, the singing masters of my soul. And so the song reiterates again, comes back, and we have this sense of the artifice of eternity, that art can somehow transcend time. Again, we can go back. Shakespeare, neither marble nor the gilded monuments of princes, those golden monuments that we saw. Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. Okay, we have a number of poems that have always addressed art as this transcendental enterprise that can outlast the limits, the physical limits of human existence. Very rarely have we seen it so pointedly presented as in this poem, where the speaker is talking very directly about being old and being on your sort of last legs, facing death, staring death down. And this is the fourth and final stanza. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make, of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past, or passing, or to come. Reiterating again, the image of gold, goldsmiths, hammered gold, gold enameling, okay, repetitive. So once out of nature, once I'm gone from this place, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing. Again, the physical body, the flesh and blood that a human being is almost very much a limitation in this poem, but takes such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling. So he becomes, the speaker here wants to be transformed into a work of art, and that work of art ends up being a golden bird to keep a drowsy emperor awake. Keep the emperor who wants to go to sleep, who's tired, keep him awake. Or set upon a golden bough to sing. Golden Bough, interestingly enough, is the title of a very famous book by an Englishman by the name of Sir James Fraser, that is a book about the realities of holidays and traditions and where they come from, and all the pagan rituals, talking about syncretism and the idea that we take our holidays from other places. So, for example, the holiday of Easter, that is actually related to the spring holidays of regeneration. And so we have all these symbols of bunnies and things like that, eggs. Those are spring symbols, symbols of the regeneration of the earth. And so James Fraser's golden bough refers here to this, the set upon a golden bough to sing, right? The golden bough actually comes from classical references. I believe it's Dante. And so it has this sense of, again, a transcendental nature, and we have this image of the gold bird that the speaker has become that will once again outlast history, outlast historic time. So this form that the speaker will take will no longer be the form of a body, a human body, tattered man on a stick, paltry thing, sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal. All of those images. In every single stanza, we have a reiteration of images of mortality, flesh, and the flesh is weak because the flesh will die. And so the speaker is seeking to transcend that. And so he finds it in that final stanza because he's going to be singing of what is past or passing or to come, right? What is past, the things that have already happened. What is passing, the things that are happening right now. And what is to come, the things that will happen in the future, right? We can draw a strong parallel here with Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, okay? If you remember, when he speaks to the urn, he talks about, when this generation has passed, you will be speaking, the urn will be communicating with people into the future, right? Similarly, Shakespeare, Sonnet 55, talks about the rhyme going on to speak to people beyond the time that we're looking at. So our mortal frame is very, very limited, but these poems, numerous poems here, speak of a power that art has that outlasts the human being and outlasts the limitations of human existence. And so here you have that in this poem. So we have two, I would say, very powerful poems by William Butler Yeats that situate us in the early 20th century within the beginnings of the modernist movement. Yeats conveys, I think, some very fascinating perspectives in the first one, The Second Coming. We have a very overtly socio-political commentary being made. And in the second one, we have, again, that classic commentary on the enduring power of art. So that is all for today, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.